Several years earlier, Steve Rogers was still getting used to life after waking up in a completely different era. Although the world around him had changed dramatically, he had found a new purpose working as an operative for SHIELD, carrying out missions aimed at protecting the nation from emerging threats. At the same time, the aftermath of the devastating attack on New York had pushed governments and security agencies to rethink how they handled global dangers. In response, SHIELD developed a massive initiative known as Project Insight. The program centered around three enormous helicarriers equipped with advanced weapon systems. Linked to a sophisticated satellite network, these airborne warships were designed to identify and eliminate potential terrorists before they could carry out any attacks. The idea was simple but controversial: stop threats before they ever had the chance to become reality. Despite the project's promise, SHIELD director Nick Fury couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Information about Project Insight seemed unusually restricted, and even he wasn't being given complete access. Determined to uncover what was being hidden, Fury secretly assigned Natasha Romanoff, better known as Black Widow, to retrieve classified data connected to the program. The operation was far from straightforward. The information was stored aboard a heavily protected vessel, making infiltration extremely difficult. To create an opening, Fury orchestrated an elaborate diversion. He arranged for a group of pirates to attack the ship, ensuring that attention would be focused elsewhere while Natasha carried out her real mission. When SHIELD received reports of the pirate assault, Captain America and a tactical team were immediately dispatched to handle the situation. Neither Steve nor the other agents knew about Fury's hidden objective. While they battled the attackers and secured the vessel, Natasha quietly completed her assignment and copied the sensitive files. Afterward, Fury attempted to access the information she had recovered. To his surprise, the files were encrypted beyond his clearance level. The discovery only deepened his suspicions. If someone was keeping secrets from the director of SHIELD himself, then something far larger was unfolding behind the scenes. Seeking answers, Fury approached Alexander Pierce, a powerful senior official within the organization. He requested that Project Insight be temporarily postponed until he could investigate further. However, before any action could be taken, events spiraled out of control. As Fury departed SHIELD headquarters, a squad of armed men disguised as police officers suddenly launched an ambush. Though caught off guard and wounded during the attack, Fury managed to fight back and escape using his heavily fortified vehicle. He barely stayed ahead of his pursuers before a far more dangerous enemy appeared. A mysterious assassin known only as the Winter Soldier emerged and unleashed a devastating attack that crippled Fury's vehicle. With no other options left, Fury used an emergency escape route, disappearing through an underground tunnel and narrowly avoiding death. By now, Fury had pieced together enough clues to realize who was responsible. Hydra, an organization long believed defeated, was somehow involved. Knowing time was running out, he headed straight to Steve Rogers' apartment. There, he warned Steve that SHIELD itself had been compromised from within. Before he could explain everything, Fury handed over a flash drive containing the stolen Project Insight files. Moments later, a sniper's bullet tore through the apartment window. The Winter Soldier had found him. Fury was rushed to the hospital, but his condition rapidly deteriorated. Before passing away, he left Steve with one final warning: trust no one. Not long afterward, Alexander Pierce confronted Steve, demanding to know why Fury had visited him. Steve immediately sensed something suspicious and refused to reveal anything. Pierce responded by ordering agents to detain him. The attempt failed spectacularly. Steve fought his way through the operatives sent after him and escaped the building. In response, SHIELD officially branded Captain America a wanted fugitive. Now on the run, Steve sought out Natasha. Both of them wanted answers regarding Fury's death and the mysterious flash drive he had left behind. Since neither knew what the encrypted data contained, they joined forces and began searching for a way to unlock it. Their investigation eventually pointed them toward a hidden facility located in New Jersey. Inside the abandoned structure, they uncovered a startling secret. Stored within an old computer system was the preserved consciousness of Dr. Arnim Zola, one of Hydra's most brilliant scientists from World War II. Through the ancient machine, Zola revealed the shocking truth. Following Hydra's apparent defeat decades earlier, the organization had never truly disappeared. Instead, it had quietly embedded itself within SHIELD and expanded from the shadows. Over the years, Hydra agents infiltrated key positions throughout the organization while posing as loyal SHIELD personnel. Unknown to the world, they had been steering events behind the scenes for generations. Zola further explained that after his physical death, Hydra preserved his mind using advanced computer technology. His knowledge remained too valuable to lose, so his consciousness continued serving the organization as an artificial intelligence. According to Zola, Hydra had learned from its previous failures. In the past, it attempted to dominate people through direct force, but resistance ultimately led to its downfall. This time, the group adopted a more subtle strategy. Rather than forcing obedience, Hydra manipulated society from behind the curtain, gradually creating conditions that encouraged people to surrender their freedoms willingly. Anyone who threatened those plans was quietly removed. Nick Fury had become one such obstacle. His growing suspicions endangered everything Hydra had worked toward. For that reason, they decided he had to die. Project Insight represented the final stage of Hydra's long-term agenda, and they couldn't allow Fury to interfere. As the conversation continued, Zola mentioned a powerful algorithm he had created. Steve and Natasha immediately demanded to know its purpose. Before he could fully explain, disaster struck. A missile suddenly slammed into the facility, triggering a massive explosion that tore through the building. The attack was no accident. Hydra had located them. Amid the chaos, Steve and Natasha barely escaped with their lives. With nowhere else to turn, they sought help from Sam Wilson, a former military veteran they had recently befriended. Sam welcomed them into his home and offered his support. Together, the trio tracked down Jasper Sitwell, a SHIELD agent secretly working for Hydra. After capturing him, they forced him to reveal everything he knew about Zola's mysterious algorithm. Under pressure, Sitwell finally confessed. The program could analyze enormous amounts of information and identify individuals who might pose a threat to Hydra, not only in the present, but potentially in the future as well. The revelation exposed Project Insight's true purpose. It was never intended to protect innocent people. The entire system had been designed as a weapon that would allow Hydra to eliminate anyone capable of opposing their rule before those individuals ever had a chance to act. Determined to stop the plan, Steve, Natasha, and Sam transported Sitwell toward SHIELD headquarters, hoping his information could help expose the conspiracy. Unfortunately, Alexander Pierce soon learned that Sitwell had been taken captive. Realizing his secrets were in danger of being exposed, Pierce immediately deployed the Winter Soldier to silence everyone involved. The deadly assassin intercepted them before they could reach their destination. His first target wasn't Captain America or his allies. Instead, he went straight for Sitwell, eliminating him before he could reveal any more of Hydra's secrets. After eliminating Sitwell, the Winter Soldier immediately turns his attention towards Steve, Natasha, and Sam. The deadly assassin launches a relentless attack, forcing the three of them into a desperate fight for survival. During the intense confrontation, a powerful blow knocks the Winter Soldier's mask loose. The moment Steve sees the man's face, he freezes in shock. It isn't a stranger beneath the mask, it's Bucky Barnes. Steve can hardly believe what he's seeing. Decades earlier, during World War II, Bucky had seemingly died during a mission after plunging from a speeding train high above a snowy mountain. Everyone, including Steve, had mourned him and accepted that he was gone forever. The truth, however, was far darker. Hydra had recovered Bucky's body after the fall. One of his arms had been severely damaged beyond repair, so their scientists replaced it with a powerful metallic prosthetic. They then subjected him to years of experimentation, brainwashing, and conditioning until his memories were stripped away. Eventually, they transformed him into an obedient super soldier whose only purpose was carrying out Hydra's orders. For more than half a century, Bucky had secretly served as Hydra's most effective weapon. Whenever the organization needed someone eliminated, they unleashed him. Between missions, he was placed into cryogenic storage, preventing him from aging while allowing Hydra to preserve their perfect assassin for decades. Although Steve instantly recognizes his oldest friend, Bucky stares back with no sign of recognition. The years of manipulation have erased nearly everything he once knew. Before Steve can reach him, additional Hydra forces arrive and overwhelm the group. The situation quickly turns against them, and Steve's allies are captured. Fortunately, help arrives from an unexpected source. Maria Hill, one of the few SHIELD agents still loyal to Fury, intervenes and helps them escape. She leads Steve, Natasha, and Sam to a hidden safe house where they make a startling discovery. Nick Fury is alive. His apparent death had been carefully staged to fool Hydra and allow him to continue investigating from the shadows. With Fury back in the picture, the team finally has a chance to strike back. Together, they begin preparing a plan to stop Project Insight before it can become operational. Fury reveals that he has developed 3 specialized control chips. If installed inside the helicarrier systems, the chips will override Hydra's programming and allow the carriers to be neutralized. Steve hopes they can complete the mission while minimizing casualties. Fury, however, understands the larger reality. Even if they succeed, S.H.I.E.L.D. itself may not survive the fallout. As the final battle approaches, Steve once again dons the iconic Captain America uniform. Sam equips his advanced Falcon flight gear, preparing for the dangerous operation ahead. The two heroes infiltrate S.H.I.E.L.D. headquarters and immediately take control of the facility's public address system. Steve broadcasts a message to every employee inside the building, exposing Hydra's infiltration and revealing the horrifying truth behind Project Insight. He explains that Hydra has secretly corrupted S.H.I.E.L.D. from within and that the helicarriers are not intended to protect innocent lives. Instead, they are designed to execute millions of people identified as potential threats. The revelation sends shockwaves throughout the organization. Loyal S.H.I.E.L.D. personnel begin resisting Hydra's operatives, and fierce battles erupt throughout the facility. Unfortunately, Hydra's numbers give them a major advantage. Despite the growing conflict, the launch sequence continues. One by one, the gigantic helicarriers rise into the sky. With time running out, Steve and Sam split up and begin installing Fury's control chips aboard the carriers. The mission progresses smoothly at first, but things quickly become more complicated when the Winter Soldier arrives. The brainwashed assassin intercepts Steve and immediately engages him in combat. Elsewhere, members of the World Security Council arrive to supervise Project Insight's activation. As they begin questioning certain aspects of the operation, Alexander Pierce realizes they are becoming a liability. Unwilling to risk exposure, Pierce prepares to eliminate them. However, before he can act, one of the council members reveals herself to be Natasha Romanoff in disguise. Having infiltrated the meeting, she stops Pierce's plan and takes control of the situation. Natasha then gains access to S.H.I.E.L.D.'s primary computer systems and begins uploading Hydra's classified files directly onto the internet. The operation will expose decades of secrets, corruption, and criminal activity to the entire world. But there is one obstacle. The system requires authorization from two senior S.H.I.E.L.D. officials before the upload can be completed. At that critical moment, Nick Fury arrives. Using his own biometric credentials along with Pierce's authorization, Fury successfully unlocks the final security barriers. Seconds later, Hydra's hidden history becomes public knowledge. Every secret operation, every assassination, and every conspiracy is suddenly available for the world to see. Pierce is furious. Realizing everything has collapsed around him, he murders the remaining council members and attempts to flee while taking Natasha with him. Before he can escape, Fury shoots him, bringing the Hydra leader's reign to an end. Meanwhile, Steve and Sam continue their mission aboard the helicarriers. They successfully install the control chips on two of the three vessels, but the final carrier remains under Hydra's control. Then disaster strikes. The Winter Soldier severely damages Sam's Falcon suit, making it nearly impossible for him to continue helping with the operation. At the same time, Hydra activates Zola's algorithm. Millions of innocent people around the globe are instantly marked as targets. The helicarriers prepare to execute them all in a matter of moments. The clock is ticking. Refusing to give up, Steve pushes forward and reaches the final carrier. Despite overwhelming odds, he manages to install the last control chip just in time. The moment it activates, all three helicarriers fall under friendly control. From a remote location, Maria Hill seizes the opportunity. She redirects the carrier's weapon systems and forces them to target one another. Massive volleys of fire erupt across the sky as the enormous warships unleash devastating attacks on each other. Within moments, the carriers begin tearing themselves apart. Explosions rip through their structures, and the gigantic machines spiral out of control before crashing into S.H.I.E.L.D. headquarters below. The destruction is catastrophic. Amid the collapsing wreckage, Steve and Bucky remain trapped together. Although Bucky is still operating under Hydra's conditioning, something inside him is beginning to change. He continues trying to complete his mission, yet fragments of his past seem to be resurfacing. The memories are faint, but they are there. As the final helicarrier plummets toward the ground, Steve refuses to fight his friend any longer. He chooses to trust that somewhere beneath the brainwashing, the real Bucky still exists. The carrier crashes into a nearby river, sending both men plunging into the water. Steve loses consciousness and begins sinking beneath the surface. For a brief moment, it appears he won't survive. Then Bucky makes a choice. Ignoring the orders that have controlled him for decades, he pulls Steve from the water and carries him to safety. Once Steve is secure, Bucky quietly disappears before anyone can find him. Some time later, Steve awakens in a hospital and learns that Hydra's global network is finally collapsing. Across the world, countless Hydra operatives are being exposed and arrested. Nick Fury, meanwhile, remains officially dead in the public eye. Choosing to stay hidden, he begins tracking down surviving Hydra leaders who escaped the purge. Natasha faces scrutiny for releasing confidential intelligence to the public, but authorities ultimately allow her to remain free. After all, the world still needs heroes capable of confronting threats on that scale. With Sam by his side, Steve turns his focus toward a more personal mission. He refuses to believe Bucky is beyond saving. Convinced that his friend can recover his lost memories, Steve begins searching for him, determined to bring him back from the darkness. In a post-credit scene, Hydra scientist Baron Strucker is shown operating a secret research facility. Using Loki's powerful scepter, he conducts experiments on human subjects in hopes of creating enhanced individuals. Most of the test subjects fail to survive. However, two twins endure the process. Wanda Maximoff and her brother Pietro emerge from the experiments with extraordinary new abilities. Strucker sees enormous potential in them and intends to use their powers against the Avengers in the future. The film ends with a quiet but meaningful moment. Bucky arrives at a museum exhibit dedicated to Captain America and the heroes of World War II. As he studies photographs and information about his former life, fragments of memory begin returning. Though he remains uncertain about who he is, the process has begun. For the first time in decades, James Buchanan Barnes is starting to remember the man he once was. It's kind of interesting looking back at where Captain America, the Winter Soldier, sits in the Marvel timeline, because at the time, it didn't necessarily feel like it was about to become such a defining movie. It arrived after the first Avenger, after the Avengers, and during a period when Marvel was still proving that all these interconnected stories could keep working without becoming repetitive. The first Captain America film had a very specific job. It had to introduce Steve Rogers, establish his origin, place him in World War II, and eventually get him to the modern day. It was carrying a lot of narrative responsibility. Because of that, it often felt like an origin story first and a Captain America movie second. The Winter Soldier walks into a completely different situation. There are no introductions to worry about anymore. No need to explain the shield, the costume, or why Steve Rogers matters. The movie starts with the assumption that you already know who he is, which gives it a freedom that the first film never really had. Instead of spending time building Captain America, it spends time challenging him. And that's what makes this movie feel so important within the trilogy. When people talk about Captain America's story across these films, this is usually the chapter where Steve Rogers becomes more than just the guy with the shield. In the first Avenger, he was learning how to become a hero. In the Winter Soldier, he's trying to figure out what kind of hero he wants to be in a world that doesn't operate on the same values he grew up with. That shift gives the movie a completely different energy. What's also fascinating is how this film sits within the wider MCU. Early Marvel movies were often focused on introducing individual heroes and building toward crossover events. The Winter Soldier feels like one of the first times the universe itself starts changing because of what happens in a single character's movie. The consequences here don't stay neatly contained inside a Captain America story. They ripple outward. Organizations, alliances, and long-standing assumptions within the MCU are suddenly questioned. The film doesn't just continue the universe, it actively reshapes it. And because of that, it ends up feeling much bigger than a standard sequel. At the same time, it never loses sight of Steve Rogers as the center of everything. Even with all the larger implications, the movie remains grounded in his perspective. We're seeing this changing world through someone who is still trying to understand it himself. That's probably why the film has aged so well. A lot of superhero sequels end up feeling like stepping stones toward another movie. You watch them, enjoy them, and move on. The Winter Soldier does connect to larger Marvel stories, but it also feels remarkably complete on its own. It has its own identity, its own tone, and its own purpose within the trilogy. If the first Avenger was about creating Captain America, and Civil War was about testing everything he believes, then The Winter Soldier is the movie that truly defines him. And looking at the MCU as a whole, it's hard not to see this film as a turning point, not just for Captain America, but for Marvel's storytelling approach in general. It showed that these movies could be more than straightforward superhero adventures. They could take familiar characters and place them inside entirely different genres while still feeling connected to the larger universe. That's a big reason why, years later, people still point to The Winter Soldier as one of the most important entries in both the Captain America trilogy and the MCU itself. One thing that kept coming up while I was watching The Winter Soldier is how confident it feels compared to the first movie. Now, that's not a knock on the first Avenger. I actually think that film does a lot of things really well. It has charm, it has heart, and it gives Steve Rogers one of the strongest origin stories in the MCU, but it also had certain limitations built into it. It was introducing a character, establishing an entire period setting, explaining his transformation, introducing supporting players, setting up future Marvel projects, and somehow still trying to tell a complete story. That's a lot to juggle. The Winter Soldier doesn't have that burden anymore. From the opening minutes, you can feel the difference. The movie doesn't spend time convincing you who Captain America is because it already assumes you've accepted him. That immediately allows the story to move faster and dig deeper. The first film was largely about Steve becoming Captain America. This one is about what happens after that. And strangely enough, that's a much more interesting question. Instead of focusing on physical transformation, the sequel focuses on emotional and ideological challenges. Steve isn't trying to prove he's worthy anymore. He's trying to figure out whether the institutions he trusted deserve that same faith in return. That gives the movie a level of complexity the first film never really aimed for. The scale feels bigger too, but not necessarily in the way people usually mean when talking about superhero movies. Sure, there are larger action sequences, bigger threats, more destruction, and more moving pieces. But what really makes the sequel feel larger is how much more ambitious it is with its storytelling. The movie mixes conspiracy, mystery, espionage, and political tension into a character story that still manages to feel personal. The first film was relatively straightforward. Good guy fights bad guys, clear mission, clear enemy, clear victory. Here things are messier, people lie, allies become suspects, organizations can't be trusted. The movie constantly shifts the ground underneath Steve Rogers, and that uncertainty keeps the story engaging. The supporting cast also feels more important this time around. Characters aren't just standing around waiting for the next action scene. Black Widow becomes a genuine partner in the story. Nick Fury gets far more to do. Falcon arrives and immediately feels like he belongs. Even smaller characters leave an impression because the script gives them purpose. The first movie had memorable characters, but this one finds more interesting ways to use them. Then there's the action. The original film certainly had action, but The Winter Soldier feels sharper, more aggressive, and far more varied. The fight scenes have a physicality that stands out. Every encounter feels like it has weight behind it rather than existing purely to move the plot from one location to another. Even the atmosphere feels different. The first movie embraced its wartime adventure roots. It had a classic heroic tone that worked well for the story it wanted to tell. The Winter Soldier chooses a much darker path. There's tension hanging over almost every scene. The feeling that something is wrong never really disappears. That sense of paranoia gives the movie a completely different identity and helps separate it from both its predecessor and many other Marvel films released around the same period. What really surprised me, though, is how much more emotionally invested I felt. Not because the sequel is more dramatic, but because Steve Rogers himself feels more layered here. The movie spends more time exploring who he is when the war is over, when the mission isn't clear, and when the world around him starts challenging everything he believes. That's where the sequel really wins. It's not simply bigger. It's not simply louder. It's not simply more expensive. It's more focused. The filmmakers already know who their main character is, so instead of introducing him, they challenge him. And by doing that, they end up creating a movie that many people see not only as the best Captain America film, but as one of the strongest entries in the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe. That's a rare achievement for any sequel. One of the reasons The Winter Soldier stood out so much when it was released is that it didn't really feel like it was trying to be another standard superhero movie. And that's a surprisingly important distinction. By the time this film arrived, audiences had already seen plenty of comic book movies. Origin stories, giant skybeam finales, colorful villains threatening the world. It was becoming a familiar formula. Even when those movies were entertaining, you could usually predict the general shape of the experience before it started. The Winter Soldier takes a different route. Sure, Captain America is still running around with a shield. There are still large action sequences. There are still comic book characters and Marvel connections everywhere. But underneath all of that, the movie is operating on a completely different wavelength. At its core, this feels much closer to a conspiracy thriller than a traditional superhero adventure. The story isn't driven by a villain announcing their plan to destroy the world. Instead, it's driven by uncertainty. Questions start piling up almost immediately. Who can Steve trust? Why are people hiding information? What is really happening inside SHIELD? Why does it feel like every answer leads to another problem? That atmosphere changes everything. Rather than moving from one action sequence to the next, the film spends a lot of time building suspicion. Characters investigate, they follow leads, they uncover secrets. They question the very organizations they work for. That's not usually how Marvel movies were structured at the time. In a lot of ways, Steve Rogers spends more of this movie acting like a detective than a superhero. And honestly, it works. The moment the film starts treating information as something dangerous, the stakes become more interesting. A secret file can suddenly be just as important as a fight scene. A conversation in an office can carry as much tension as a battle. That's what gives the movie its unique identity. Even visually, the film leans into that spy thriller energy. There are surveillance operations, covert missions, hidden agendas, encrypted data, safe houses, assassins, manhunts, and people constantly watching each other. The world feels less like a fantasy playground and more like a place where power operates behind closed doors. What makes it even more effective is that Captain America himself feels slightly out of place in this environment. Steve Rogers comes from a world where enemies were easier to identify. His moral compass points in a very clear direction. He's used to confronting threats directly. Now he's trapped in a situation where deception is everywhere. Nobody gives him a straight answer. Every institution seems compromised. Even the people standing beside him may not be who they appear to be. That clash between Steve's straightforward nature and the murky world around him creates some of the film's most compelling moments. And it's probably why the movie feels fresher than many of its contemporaries. The superhero elements are still there, but they aren't the entire attraction. They're woven into a larger framework built around espionage, distrust, investigation, and political intrigue. The action scenes benefit from that approach too. When fights happen, they don't feel like random interruptions designed to keep audiences entertained. Most of them emerge naturally from the story. Someone's trying to escape. Someone's being hunted. Someone's protecting information that could expose a larger conspiracy. The action has purpose because the thriller narrative gives it purpose. That's a huge reason why so many people remember The Winter Soldier differently from other Marvel films of the era. It wasn't trying to reinvent Captain America by changing who he was. It reinvented the environment around him. Instead of dropping him into another straightforward superhero conflict, it placed him inside a world of secrets, betrayal, and paranoia. Suddenly, the guy carrying the shield wasn't just fighting enemies. He was trying to figure out who the enemies actually were. And that simple shift transformed what could have been a routine sequel into something that felt far more distinctive. Years later, people still describe The Winter Soldier as one of Marvel's best examples of genre blending, not because it abandons the superhero formula completely, but because it understands that comic book characters can thrive inside different kinds of stories. In this case, the result was a superhero movie that often feels like a spy thriller first, and that's exactly what makes it memorable. What really surprised me about The Winter Soldier isn't that it has political themes. A lot of superhero movies touch on politics in one way or another. It's how central those ideas are to the entire story. Take away the action scenes, the shield throws, the explosions, and even the conspiracy itself, and what you're left with is a debate. A pretty uncomfortable one, actually. How much freedom are people willing to give up in exchange for safety? That's the question sitting underneath almost everything that happens in this movie. And what makes it work is that the film doesn't present the issue as something distant or abstract. The conflict feels rooted in real fears that people already had, concerns about surveillance, concerns about governments collecting information, concerns about security programs becoming so powerful that they eventually stop protecting people and start controlling them. The movie taps directly into that anxiety. What's interesting is that nobody really sees themselves as the villain. The people pushing these extreme security measures believe they're preventing future disasters. They argue that if technology can identify threats before they happen, then why wait for innocent people to get hurt? On paper, that logic sounds reasonable, maybe even persuasive. That's what makes the conflict stronger than a simple good versus evil scenario, because Steve Rogers isn't fighting against a giant robot or some alien invasion this time. He's fighting against an idea, and ideas are harder to punch. Throughout the film, Steve keeps running into systems designed around prediction, control, and preemptive action. The belief that potential threats should be dealt with before they ever become actual threats. The problem, at least from Steve's perspective, is what gets lost in that process: choice, freedom. The possibility that people can be more than what a system predicts they'll become. That's where his character becomes so important. Steve Rogers represents a very old-fashioned belief in individual freedom and personal responsibility. He trusts people more than algorithms. He trusts human judgment more than automated systems. Even when the world around him becomes increasingly complicated, he refuses to surrender that core principle. And honestly, that's part of what makes him such an effective protagonist for this story. A different hero might approach the situation differently. Steve doesn't. For him, protecting freedom means accepting uncertainty. It means recognizing that security can never be absolute. It means understanding that eliminating every possible risk often comes at a cost that's too high. The film never stops to deliver lengthy speeches about these issues. Instead, it builds them into the narrative itself. Every betrayal, every secret, every hidden agenda, every attempt to justify greater control, all of it circles back to the same fundamental conflict. How much power should any institution be allowed to possess? What's impressive is that the movie manages to explore these questions without losing its entertainment value. It never feels like a lecture. It never forgets that it's still supposed to be an exciting blockbuster. The action keeps moving. The mystery keeps unfolding. The tension keeps building. But beneath all of that, there's a layer of substance that gives the story extra weight. You can actually feel the film wrestling with something larger than its immediate plot. And that's probably one of the biggest reasons The Winter Soldier has remained relevant long after its release. A lot of superhero movies are tied very closely to the year they came out. Their themes fade as trends change. The concerns raised here haven't really disappeared. If anything, discussions about privacy, surveillance, data collection, and personal freedom have become even more common, which means the movie's central question still lands. Maybe even more than it did when audiences first watched it. That's what elevates this beyond being just another Marvel adventure. Underneath the espionage, the action, and the comic book spectacle is a story asking whether absolute security is worth the price of individual freedom, and whether a society can remain free once it starts sacrificing its principles in pursuit of safety. For a film that features a guy throwing a vibranium shield at people, that's a surprisingly thoughtful place to take the conversation. One of the smartest things The Winter Soldier does is take elements that had mostly been sitting in the background of previous Marvel movies and suddenly make them the center of the story. Before this film, SHIELD was basically the organization that showed up whenever the plot needed answers. They had the resources, the technology, the helicarriers, the secret files, and of course Nick Fury walking around acting like he already knew what was going to happen 3 movies from now. They were important, but they were also kind of taken for granted. You just assumed they were the good guys, or at the very least, the people on the right side of the fight. The Winter Soldier takes that assumption and slowly starts pulling it apart. And honestly, that's where a lot of the movie's tension comes from. At first, nothing seems completely wrong. There are small cracks here and there. Steve asks questions. Certain decisions feel questionable. Some information is being hidden, but it doesn't immediately feel like a massive conspiracy. Then the deeper the story goes, the more uncomfortable everything becomes. What's fascinating is that the movie doesn't just reveal a hidden enemy. It reveals that the enemy has been sitting inside the system for years. That changes the entire dynamic. Suddenly, every meeting, every operation, every authority figure becomes suspect. The threat isn't coming from outside anymore. It's already inside the walls. That's a much scarier idea. Hydra's presence in the film works because it transforms what initially feels like a spy investigation into something much bigger. What starts as questions about secrecy eventually becomes a revelation about infiltration, corruption, and the dangers of institutions becoming so powerful that nobody questions them anymore. And while Hydra obviously functions as the primary antagonist force, the movie uses them for more than just creating conflict. They become a symbol of what happens when power operates without accountability. The really clever part is how this impacts Steve Rogers personally. Steve isn't simply discovering that bad people exist. He's discovering that an organization he trusted has been compromised at its core. That's a different kind of betrayal, a personal one. For someone whose worldview is built around loyalty, duty, and trust, finding out that those foundations aren't as solid as he believed creates some of the strongest dramatic moments in the film. It forces him to reevaluate everything, not just who he can trust, but whether the systems he's been serving are worthy of that trust in the first place. The world building benefits enormously from this approach. Instead of expanding the universe by introducing endless new locations or dozens of new factions, the movie expands it by adding complexity. Suddenly, the MCU feels larger because it feels less certain. The audience starts realizing that not every institution is what it appears to be. Not every ally remains an ally. Not every mission has honest intentions behind it. That uncertainty makes the world feel more alive. It also helps that the film spends time exploring how deeply connected these organizations are to everyday events. The consequences aren't isolated to one battle or one city. The decisions being made have enormous implications, which gives the conflict a sense of scale without constantly relying on destruction to create importance. and in many ways, this becomes one of the most significant turning points in the broader MCU. Not because of a giant crossover, not because of a new superhero arriving, but because the movie fundamentally changes how audiences view one of the franchise's most important institutions. After this film, it's impossible to look at SHIELD the same way again. The illusion is gone, the blind trust is gone, the certainty is gone, and that's exactly why the world feels richer afterward. A lot of superhero movies build bigger worlds by adding more things. The Winter Soldier makes its world bigger by questioning the things that were already there. That's a much harder trick to pull off, and it's one of the reasons the film's world building remains so effective years later. One thing I didn't fully appreciate the first time I watched The Winter Soldier was just how much of the movie is built around questions. Not action, not spectacle, questions. That's a big reason the story stays engaging even during scenes where nobody is throwing punches or crashing through windows. The movie constantly gives you something to wonder about. Why was information hidden from Steve? Who can actually be trusted? Why is Nick Fury suddenly acting paranoid? Who is really pulling the strings behind the scenes? And perhaps most importantly, what exactly is the truth behind the Winter Soldier himself? The film understands something that a lot of blockbuster movies forget. Curiosity is powerful. If audiences genuinely want answers, they'll stay invested. And that's exactly what happens here. The story isn't structured like a traditional superhero movie where the villain is identified early and the rest of the film becomes a race toward the inevitable final battle. Instead, it unfolds piece by piece. Information arrives gradually. New discoveries reshape old assumptions. Every answer seems to open another door. It's surprisingly patient in that regard. The movie trusts the audience enough to let the mystery develop rather than explaining everything immediately. That approach creates a very different viewing experience. For large stretches of the film, Steve Rogers isn't pursuing a villain, he's pursuing the truth, and those aren't always the same thing. That's where the conspiracy element becomes so effective. The deeper Steve digs, the larger the problem becomes. At first it feels like isolated corruption, then it becomes organizational corruption, then something even bigger. The scope keeps expanding, but it does so naturally because every revelation grows directly out of the previous one. Nothing feels completely random. There's a sense that the filmmakers actually know where they're going. That might sound like a basic compliment, but it's more important than it seems. Conspiracy stories can easily become messy. They introduce too many players, too many twists, too many hidden agendas, and eventually the audience stops caring because keeping track of everything becomes exhausting. The Winter Soldier gets close to that line at times. There are definitely moments when a lot of information is being thrown around. Multiple characters have secrets. Organizations are working against each other. Loyalties shift. New layers of the conspiracy keep emerging. But for the most part, the film manages to stay coherent because the emotional focus never leaves Steve Rogers. No matter how complicated the conspiracy becomes, the audience always understands what Steve is trying to accomplish. That emotional anchor keeps the story grounded. The mystery also benefits from the fact that it doesn't rely entirely on shocking twists. There are reveals throughout the movie, some more surprising than others, but the real strength isn't the surprise itself. It's the tension created while moving toward those reveals. The feeling that something isn't right, the feeling that information is being deliberately hidden, the feeling that every new discovery might make the situation worse instead of better. That's what drives the narrative forward, and honestly, it gives the film a level of suspense that many superhero movies never even attempt. There are scenes here that play more like thriller sequences than comic book storytelling. Characters investigate old files, they follow clues, they uncover buried secrets, they're forced to question people they once trusted. The tension comes from uncertainty rather than physical danger. At least until the physical danger inevitably shows up. What I particularly like is that the conspiracy isn't just there to create plot mechanics. It directly supports the movie's larger themes. Questions about trust, power, freedom, and institutional corruption all become stronger because the audience is uncovering the truth alongside the characters. You're not being told what to think. You're discovering it as the story unfolds. That makes the experience much more immersive. By the time the film reaches its final act, the mystery aspect naturally gives way to larger action and spectacle. That's expected. This is still a Marvel movie, after all. But the reason those climactic moments work is because the groundwork has already been laid. The audience understands what's at stake. They understand who betrayed whom. They understand why the conflict matters. And they understand exactly how everything spiraled into chaos. That's the sign of a well-constructed conspiracy narrative. The answers feel earned because the questions were worth asking in the first place. And that's a major reason The Winter Soldier remains so compelling. It's not just a movie about stopping a threat, it's a movie about uncovering one. One of the more interesting conversations surrounding The Winter Soldier is whether the movie is actually as complex as people often claim it is. Because if we're being honest, the plot itself isn't impossibly complicated. This isn't one of those movies where you need a whiteboard, 3 rewatches, and a conspiracy chart connected by red string just to understand what's happening. The basic story is actually pretty straightforward. Steve Rogers discovers something is wrong. He investigates. A larger conspiracy is uncovered. Hidden enemies reveal themselves. A dangerous plan has to be stopped. That's the skeleton of the plot. Simple enough. What makes the movie feel more sophisticated than many superhero films isn't complexity for complexity's sake. It's the way information is delivered. The film layers its story. Instead of presenting everything immediately, it gradually reveals pieces of the puzzle. Characters possess different levels of knowledge. Certain motivations remain hidden. Some conversations carry meanings that only become clear later. As a result, the audience is constantly reevaluating situations as new information arrives. That's different from being complicated. It's being carefully constructed. And honestly, that's a much harder thing to pull off. A lot of movies mistake confusion for intelligence. They overload viewers with details and assume that if people are struggling to follow the story, it must be deep. The Winter Soldier doesn't really do that. For the most part, you always understand the objective. You always understand Steve's motivation. You always understand the emotional stakes. The movie simply chooses not to reveal everything at once. That distinction matters. Because while the plot introduces multiple characters, secret agendas, hidden loyalties, intelligence operations, and political maneuvering, it never completely loses control of itself. There are definitely moments where things get busy. A few reviewers have pointed out that the second half occasionally feels crowded. New information arrives quickly. Several plot threads converge at the same time. The film starts juggling a lot of moving parts simultaneously, and honestly, that's a fair criticism. There are moments where the movie seems almost too eager to keep adding another layer to the conspiracy. But what's impressive is that it rarely collapses under that weight. The structure keeps pushing forward. Every major revelation serves a purpose. Every new development creates momentum rather than stopping it. That's why the pacing remains strong, despite the amount of information being introduced. Another thing that helps is how the narrative constantly alternates between exposition and action. Whenever the story risks becoming too dense, the film shifts gears. A chase sequence happens. A fight breaks out. Somebody gets ambushed. The tension becomes physical again. Then once the audience has had a chance to breathe, the mystery starts unfolding further. It's a balancing act, and for the most part, the movie handles it surprisingly well. What's also worth mentioning is that the plot doesn't exist purely to generate twists. Some thriller movies become obsessed with shocking the audience. Every reveal is designed to outsmart viewers rather than serve the story. Here, most of the major developments are connected to character decisions and thematic ideas. The revelations matter because they change how Steve sees the world around him. The conspiracy isn't just a plot device. It's the mechanism through which the movie explores trust, authority, loyalty, and personal responsibility. That's what gives the narrative weight. Even when certain twists are predictable, the emotional consequences still land. And that's ultimately more important. I've always felt that a great plot isn't necessarily the one that surprises you the most. It's the one where everything feels connected once the pieces come together. The Winter Soldier largely succeeds because of that. The story keeps expanding without completely losing focus. The mysteries deepen without becoming incomprehensible. The conspiracy grows larger without overwhelming the emotional core. And by the end, there's a satisfying sense that all of these moving parts were working toward the same destination. That's probably why the film still holds up so well. Not because it's the most complicated story Marvel has ever told, but because it's one of the most carefully assembled. One thing that really stands out about The Winter Soldier is how quickly it gets moving. A lot of superhero sequels spend their opening act reminding you what happened before. They reintroduce characters, reestablish relationships, catch everyone up on the current status quo, and sometimes it can take 30 or 40 minutes before the story actually starts. This movie doesn't have much interest in doing that. It gets right into it. Within the first few minutes, you're already watching Steve Rogers in action. Not long after that, questions start appearing, then secrets, then suspicions. Then suddenly, the entire situation begins spiraling into something much bigger. The film wastes very little time, and what's impressive is that it maintains that forward momentum for almost its entire runtime. That's not easy when you're dealing with a story that contains espionage elements, conspiracies, multiple supporting characters, political themes, action sequences, and a mystery that needs to unfold gradually. Normally, one of those elements would slow everything down. Here, they somehow keep feeding each other. Every time the story pauses to reveal new information, that information creates a new problem. Every new problem pushes the characters somewhere else. Every new location uncovers another layer of the mystery. The movie is constantly moving, not necessarily in terms of physical action, just movement, narrative movement. There's a difference. Some films confuse pacing with speed. They think as long as characters are running, fighting, shouting, or jumping between locations, the audience will stay engaged. But that's not really pacing. Pacing is about maintaining interest. And The Winter Soldier understands that. There are actually plenty of scenes where characters are simply talking, investigating, sharing information, trying to figure things out. Yet those scenes rarely feel slow because they usually contain something important, a clue, a revelation, a conflict, a shift in trust between characters. The conversations are moving the story forward. That's why they work. One of the smartest decisions the film makes is how it alternates between tension and release. You'll get a sequence filled with suspicion and uncertainty, then a burst of action, then another mystery, then another confrontation, then another reveal. The rhythm keeps changing. The movie never sits in one mode for too long. That variety does a lot of heavy lifting. It prevents the conspiracy material from becoming overly dense, and it prevents the action from becoming repetitive. Each section feels like it's serving a purpose within a larger flow. Even the film's runtime benefits from this approach. On paper, it's a fairly long movie, but it rarely feels like one. In fact, one of the most common reactions people have after revisiting The Winter Soldier is surprise at how quickly it seems to pass. You sit down expecting a lengthy Marvel blockbuster, and suddenly the final act is arriving. Part of that comes from the story structure, but part of it comes from the constant sense of urgency. The characters are always reacting to something. They're being hunted, they're uncovering secrets, they're losing allies, they're finding new leads. The story rarely allows them to become comfortable, which means the audience never becomes comfortable either. And that's a good thing. There are a few moments where the film briefly threatens to become overloaded with information. Some of the conspiracy details arrive in rapid succession, and certain sections ask the audience to absorb quite a lot at once. But even then, the movie doesn't linger. It keeps pushing forward. The momentum carries it through. I think that's one reason why many people rank this among Marvel's strongest films. Even viewers who aren't especially invested in the political themes or espionage elements can still enjoy the experience because the pacing is so effective. The film always seems to know exactly when to reveal something, when to escalate something, and when to switch gears. There's very little dead air, very little wasted motion. And while some movies become exhausting because they're constantly accelerating, The Winter Soldier finds a balance. It's fast without feeling rushed, busy without feeling chaotic, and energetic without becoming overwhelming. That's a surprisingly difficult balance to achieve, and it's one of the film's most underrated strengths. Because long after specific plot details fade from memory, what often remains is the feeling that the movie never stopped pulling you forward. And that's exactly what great pacing is supposed to do. One thing that immediately separates The Winter Soldier from a lot of superhero movies is that it genuinely feels like something could go wrong. That might sound obvious. Every blockbuster wants you to believe there's danger. Every hero faces a threat. Every movie raises the stakes. But there's a difference between being told something is dangerous and actually feeling it. The Winter Soldier does a much better job with the second one. Part of that comes from the way the story is structured. Steve Rogers doesn't spend most of the film in control of the situation. In fact, for large portions of the movie, he's reacting rather than leading. That's unusual. Normally, Captain America is the guy charging forward with a plan. Here, he's constantly trying to catch up, trying to figure out who's lying, trying to understand what's happening, trying to determine who he can trust. That uncertainty creates tension almost immediately, because once trust disappears, every interaction becomes more dangerous. A simple conversation suddenly matters. A routine mission suddenly feels suspicious. A familiar face suddenly becomes a question mark. The threat isn't always physical. Sometimes it's informational. Sometimes it's psychological. Sometimes it's just the realization that the people you thought were on your side may not actually be on your side at all. And honestly, that's where a lot of the movie's strongest tension comes from. The conspiracy itself creates an atmosphere where nobody seems completely safe. Characters who normally feel untouchable suddenly become vulnerable. Authority figures lose their certainty. Power structures start collapsing. The audience begins to understand that the situation is much larger than any single fight. That's important because the film never relies entirely on destruction to create urgency. There are certainly large-scale consequences hanging over the story, massive consequences, actually, but before the movie starts thinking globally, it makes things personal. Steve loses trust in the institution he serves. Allies are forced into hiding, relationships become strained, people are hunted, people disappear, people get hurt. The danger feels close before it feels massive, and that approach makes the larger stakes more effective later on. Another thing I appreciate is that the film allows its villains to feel competent. They're organized, they're patient, they've been planning for a long time. They aren't simply waiting around for the hero to arrive and stop them. The threat already exists before Steve even realizes it. That's a subtle difference, but it matters. It creates the feeling that events are unfolding regardless of whether the hero is ready for them. The Winter Soldier himself contributes to that atmosphere as well. Whenever he appears, there's an immediate shift in energy, not because he's delivering speeches or making grand declarations, but because he feels dangerous, efficient. Relentless, you get the sense that if someone crosses his path, there's a good chance things won't end well for them. The film benefits from having an antagonist who creates tension simply by showing up. What's also interesting is how often the heroes are placed at a disadvantage. They're outnumbered, they're being monitored, they're cut off from resources, they're forced to operate without the support systems they normally depend on. For a movie featuring superpowered characters, there are surprisingly long stretches where the protagonists feel vulnerable. That vulnerability keeps the suspense alive. Even when you know Captain America will survive, you're not always sure what the cost will be. And that's where the stakes become meaningful, because the story isn't only asking whether the heroes can win, it's asking what they'll lose along the way: their trust, their friendships, their beliefs, their sense of certainty. Sometimes those losses hit harder than physical damage. By the time the film reaches its climax, the stakes have grown enormously, but they still feel connected to the emotional conflicts established earlier. The danger isn't just about stopping a catastrophe, it's about preserving principles, protecting freedom, holding on to values that seem increasingly difficult to maintain. That's why the tension works. The movie gives you external stakes and internal stakes at the same time, a threat to the world, and a threat to the people trying to save it. When those two things are working together, the danger feels real. And The Winter Soldier understands that better than most superhero films of its era. One aspect of The Winter Soldier that I think often gets overshadowed by the action and conspiracy elements is just how much of the film is about Steve Rogers trying to find his place in a world that moved on without him. And honestly, that's one of the most human parts of the entire movie. It's easy to forget because we're talking about Captain America, the super soldier, the Avenger, the guy who can jump out of aircraft and somehow make it look routine. But underneath all of that, Steve is still dealing with something incredibly difficult. He lost decades, not metaphorically, not emotionally, literally. The world kept spinning while he was frozen. People aged, people died. Technology evolved, culture changed, entire generations came and went, and then one day he wakes up and is expected to continue living as if none of that happened. That's a lot to process. What I like is that the film doesn't constantly stop to remind you of it. Instead, it quietly weaves that struggle into Steve's everyday life. There are small moments scattered throughout the movie that reveal how disconnected he still feels. His notebook is probably the best example. It's such a simple detail, but it tells you everything. Here's a man trying to catch up on decades of history, entertainment, technology, and culture by writing things down so he doesn't forget them. It's funny at first, then the more you think about it, the sadder it becomes. Because that notebook represents time he can never get back. Every item on that list is a reminder that he missed an entire life. And the movie never lets that reality completely disappear. Even when Steve is saving the world, there's still this underlying sense that he's slightly out of sync with everything around him. You can see it in how he interacts with people. You can see it in how he views institutions. You can even see it in how he responds to modern moral compromises. The world Steve comes from is far from perfect, but his understanding of right and wrong feels much more direct. The modern world he's living in now operates in shades of gray. Secrets are justified, surveillance is justified, compromises are justified, and Steve never seems entirely comfortable with that. That's what makes his adjustment so interesting. The challenge isn't just learning new technology or understanding modern culture. It's adapting to a completely different worldview. One where certainty has largely been replaced by ambiguity. One where trust is harder to earn. One where institutions don't always live up to the ideals they claim to represent. The film uses that disconnect really effectively. Rather than treating Steve's old-fashioned perspective as a weakness, it often becomes his greatest strength. Because while everyone else has become accustomed to the way things work, Steve still has enough distance to question them. He notices things other people accept. He challenges ideas that others take for granted. He asks uncomfortable questions, and that's partly because he's still looking at this world as someone who never fully became part of it. There's also a loneliness to the character that the film handles surprisingly well, not an obvious loneliness, not the kind where characters constantly talk about it, a quieter loneliness. The feeling of being surrounded by people, but still carrying experiences nobody else can truly understand. Steve has friends, he has allies, but he also has memories of an entire life that no longer exists. And that weight follows him throughout the movie. What makes the performance work so well is that Chris Evans rarely plays this for sympathy. Steve doesn't spend the film feeling sorry for himself. He keeps moving forward. He keeps adapting. He keeps trying. That's what makes him relatable. The struggle isn't that he's failing to adjust. The struggle is that adjustment never really ends. Every day is another reminder that he's living in a future he never expected to see. And that tension gives the character a depth that goes far beyond the superhero elements. Because beneath the shield, beneath the missions, beneath the action sequences, the Winter Soldier is also telling the story of a man trying to build a new life after losing the old one. And sometimes that's just as compelling as any fight scene. One thing I've always found interesting about Captain America is that, on paper, he probably shouldn't be one of Marvel's most compelling characters. Think about it, he's honest. He's sincere, he believes in doing the right thing. He follows a moral code. He doesn't have a dark alter ego. He doesn't have an ego the size of a planet. He doesn't constantly blur the line between hero and antihero. He's not driven by revenge. He's not hiding some secret corruption. In modern storytelling, characters like that often get labeled as boring, and yet the Winter Soldier somehow turns those exact qualities into the film's greatest strength. The reason is simple. The movie doesn't challenge Steve Rogers physically as much as it challenges his principles, and that's a far more interesting battle. Throughout the film, Steve finds himself surrounded by people who believe the world has changed. They argue that old ideals are outdated, that security sometimes requires compromise, that freedom occasionally needs to take a back seat to practicality. On some level, their arguments even make sense. That's what makes the conflict work. The movie isn't presenting obvious villains twirling mustaches and announcing evil plans. It's presenting a world where good intentions can slowly justify dangerous ideas. And Steve is standing right in the middle of it. What makes him unique is that he refuses to let circumstances redefine his values, not because he's stubborn, not because he's naive, but because he genuinely believes principles only matter when they're difficult to maintain. Anyone can talk about freedom when things are easy. Anyone can talk about doing the right thing when there are no consequences. The real test comes when fear enters the equation, when danger enters the equation, when sacrificing a principle suddenly seems convenient. That's where Steve draws the line, and honestly, that's why the character works so well in this story. A lot of heroes adapt themselves to fit the world around them. Steve spends most of the movie asking whether the world around him has lost its way. That's a very different perspective. There's a moment that keeps surfacing throughout the film where Steve feels almost out of place. He's surrounded by advanced technology, intelligence networks, surveillance systems, and organizations that operate in moral gray areas. Yet somehow he's the person who sees the situation most clearly. The guy who spent 70 years frozen ends up being the one least willing to accept questionable compromises. There's something powerful about that. The film never portrays Steve as perfect. He can be rigid. He can be idealistic. He can struggle to understand the complexities of modern systems. But those flaws actually reinforce what makes him valuable. Because his role isn't to provide easy answers. His role is to ask difficult questions. Questions nobody else seems willing to ask anymore. Questions about power. Questions about accountability. Questions about whether protecting people is still protection if it comes at the cost of their freedom. That's where Captain America becomes more than just a superhero. He becomes a moral reference point. Not because he's always right, but because he's one of the few characters who consistently refuses to abandon his principles when they're tested, and the movie constantly tests them. Every major conflict in the story eventually circles back to Steve's belief in individual choice, personal responsibility, and human dignity. The conspiracy matters because it threatens those ideas. The villains matter because they've abandoned those ideas. The stakes matter because those ideas are what's being protected. That's why the film feels different from a lot of other superhero stories. The central battle isn't really about strength. It's about values. It's about whether doing the right thing still matters in a world that increasingly rewards convenience, control, and compromise. and Steve Rogers never stops believing that it does. That's what gives the character his weight. Not the shield, not the super soldier serum, not the costume, the conviction, the willingness to stand by what he believes even when everyone around him thinks he's being unrealistic. In lesser hands, that could have felt old-fashioned. In The Winter Soldier, it becomes one of the film's most important strengths, because while the world around Steve keeps changing, his moral compass doesn't, and sometimes that's exactly what the story needs. One of the reasons The Winter Soldier works so well as a sequel is that it understands something a lot of superhero franchises struggle with. The origin story is over. Steve Rogers already became Captain America. The transformation happened, the shield was earned, the hero emerged, the audience knows who he is, so the obvious question becomes, now what? And that's where this movie finds its emotional core. Because beneath all the espionage, conspiracy theories, assassins, and collapsing organizations, The Winter Soldier is really about a man trying to figure out who he is when the war he was built for no longer exists. That's a fascinating place to take the character. In the first film, Steve had clarity. The world was dangerous, but he knew where he stood. He knew who the enemy was. He knew what he was fighting for. His purpose felt obvious. In The Winter Soldier, that certainty starts disappearing. For the first time, Steve finds himself questioning the institutions around him, the people he works with, the methods being used, even the larger system he's helping defend. And once those doubts start appearing, they don't go away. What I really like is that the movie doesn't treat this as a temporary obstacle. It treats it as a genuine identity crisis. Because Steve's entire life has been built around service, duty, sacrifice, loyalty. Those aren't just things he believes in, they're things that define him. So when the organizations representing those values begin betraying them, Steve is forced to ask an uncomfortable question. If the system is broken, what exactly am I serving? That's a much deeper conflict than simply stopping a villain. The film keeps putting Steve in situations where following orders would be easier, safer, cleaner. But every time his conscience pushes him in a different direction. And that's really the heart of his journey, not choosing between right and wrong, choosing between obedience and integrity. Those aren't always the same thing. The movie understands that. There's also something quietly powerful about how isolated Steve becomes throughout the story, not physically, emotionally. The people around him operate in shades of gray. They understand secrets, manipulation, intelligence operations, and moral compromise. Steve doesn't naturally think that way. His instincts are different. That leaves him feeling increasingly disconnected from the world he's trying to protect. And honestly, that's part of what makes him so compelling. He isn't struggling because he's weak. He's struggling because his principles keep colliding with reality. The film never suggests that Steve has all the answers. In fact, there are several moments where he clearly doesn't, but what he does have is conviction. And throughout the movie, that conviction gets tested repeatedly. Every revelation forces him to reevaluate something. Every betrayal removes another layer of certainty. Every decision pushes him further away from the comfortable role he thought he occupied. By the time the story reaches its final act, Steve isn't the same person we met at the beginning. He's still Captain America, but his understanding of what that means has changed. The symbol remains the same. The mission does not. And that's where the character growth becomes really effective. The movie isn't interested in changing Steve's values. It's interested in refining his understanding of them, helping him realize that loyalty to principles is more important than loyalty to institutions, that doing the right thing sometimes requires standing against the very systems you're supposed to support, and that being a hero isn't about following orders, it's about knowing when not to. That's a much more mature conflict than most superhero sequels attempt. It's not flashy, it's not something you can solve with a punch, but it gives the entire film emotional weight. When people talk about The Winter Soldier, they often focus on the action, the conspiracy, or the political themes, and those things are great. But underneath all of that is a surprisingly personal story about a man redefining himself, a man trying to figure out where he belongs, a man discovering that the role he was given and the person he wants to be aren't necessarily the same thing. And in many ways, that's the real journey of The Winter Soldier, not Steve Rogers saving the world, Steve Rogers figuring out who he wants to be in it. For a movie that's packed with action scenes, conspiracies, assassins, and political intrigue, some of the most emotional moments in The Winter Soldier are surprisingly quiet. No explosions, no fights, no dramatic speeches, just Steve Rogers confronting the reality of everything he lost, and nowhere is that more apparent than in the film's handling of Peggy Carter. It's a relatively small part of the movie when you look at screen time, but emotionally, it carries an enormous amount of weight, because Peggy isn't just an old friend. She's a reminder of an entire life that Steve never got to live. That's what makes their scenes together hit so hard. Throughout the MCU, there's always this temptation to view Steve's story through the lens of heroism, the sacrifices he made, the battles he fought, the lives he saved. But the Winter Soldier pauses long enough to acknowledge the personal cost of all that, and it's devastating when you really think about it. Steve didn't just lose years, he lost possibilities, he lost a future, he lost relationships. He lost ordinary experiences that most people take for granted. Peggy represents all of that. When Steve visits her, the movie suddenly becomes less about Captain America and more about Steve Rogers, a man looking directly at the consequences of his own history. What makes the scene especially powerful is that it avoids melodrama. The film trusts the audience to understand what's happening without overselling it. There's sadness in the room, but it's not exaggerated sadness. It's quieter than that, more human, more real. Steve isn't mourning a single person. He's mourning an entire chapter of his life. And the movie understands that grief doesn't always arrive as an emotional breakdown. Sometimes it arrives as acceptance. Sometimes it arrives as silence. Sometimes it arrives as the realization that time kept moving even when you weren't there to experience it. That's exactly what these scenes capture. The film also uses Peggy to reinforce one of its most important themes, Steve's struggle to find a place in the modern world. Because every time he looks backward, he's reminded of how much has changed. And every time he looks forward, he's confronted with a future he never expected to inherit. He's caught between two worlds, the one he remembers and the one he now lives in. Peggy becomes the bridge between them, a living connection to the past that's slowly slipping away. There's also something deeply tragic about the fact that Steve's memories remain frozen in time while everyone else's continued moving forward. For him, those experiences still feel recent. For the world around him, their history. That disconnect creates a loneliness that follows him throughout the film. You can feel it even when nobody's talking about it. It's always there beneath the surface. And that's part of why the emotional impact of The Winter Soldier works better than many people give it credit for. The movie doesn't constantly announce its emotional themes. It lets them emerge naturally through moments like these, through conversations, through memories, through people who represent pieces of Steve's former life. Peggy isn't included simply for nostalgia. She's there because she helps us understand Steve. She reminds us that behind the superhero costume is someone still carrying emotional scars from a life interrupted decades ago. Someone who never got closure. Someone who never got the ending he expected. And that's what makes their relationship so important to the film. It's not really about romance, at least not entirely. It's about loss. It's about memory. It's about the painful realization that you can't go back, no matter how much part of you wants to. By the time Steve leaves those scenes behind, you understand something crucial about his character. The greatest challenge he faces isn't adapting to modern technology. It isn't fighting villains. It isn't surviving conspiracies. It's learning how to move forward while carrying a past that never truly lets go. And the Winter Soldier handles that struggle with far more emotional maturity than most superhero movies even attempt. One thing that really surprised me when revisiting The Winter Soldier is how well it handles its cast. Because on paper, this movie has every reason to feel overcrowded. You've got Captain America, Black Widow, Nick Fury, Falcon, The Winter Soldier, Alexander Pierce, Maria Hill, various SHIELD agents, Hydra operatives, returning characters from previous films, and multiple storylines all competing for attention. That sounds like the recipe for a movie where half the characters end up feeling forgotten. But somehow, it mostly works. And I think the reason is that the film understands an important distinction. There's a difference between having a lot of characters and having too many characters. The Winter Soldier gives most of its major players a purpose. They're not just standing around waiting for their turn in the action scenes. Almost everyone contributes something meaningful to either the plot, the themes, or Steve's personal journey. More importantly, the supporting cast never overshadows Captain America. That's a balance the movie handles surprisingly well. There were plenty of opportunities for this to become a pseudo-Avengers film where Steve gets lost among the ensemble, but the story always finds its way back to him. Every major relationship ultimately reveals something about Steve Rogers. Every alliance forces him to make decisions. Every conflict tests his beliefs. The supporting characters aren't there to replace the protagonist. They're there to challenge him, and that's a huge reason why the character dynamics feel so effective. What's also interesting is how much trust becomes part of the team dynamic. Most superhero teams are built around cooperation. This one is built around uncertainty. Nobody fully trusts anyone at first. Secrets exist between allies. Information is withheld. Motives are questioned. Loyalties are constantly under scrutiny. That tension creates a completely different kind of chemistry. The relationships feel more active because they're constantly evolving. Characters aren't simply agreeing with each other, they're challenging each other, questioning each other, trying to figure each other out. And because the film is structured around conspiracy and paranoia, those interactions become just as important as the action sequences. I also appreciate how the movie allows different personalities to bounce off one another naturally. Steve's straightforward honesty contrasts with Black Widow's secrecy. Nick Fury's pragmatism clashes with Steve's idealism. Falcon brings a more grounded perspective. Each character approaches problems differently, which prevents the team from feeling like a group of people who all think the same way. That variety keeps conversations interesting. It also helps that the movie avoids turning every interaction into a joke competition. There's humor here, absolutely, but the relationships are built on more than punchlines. They're built on mutual respect, disagreement, trust, betrayal, loyalty, and shared experiences. Those things give the dynamic substance. Another strength is that the film gradually earns its team formation rather than forcing it. The characters don't immediately become a perfectly coordinated unit. The relationships develop over time. People learn who they can rely on. Trust is established through actions rather than speeches. That's why the eventual partnerships feel convincing. The movie understands that teamwork is more satisfying when it's earned. And while some characters naturally receive more attention than others, very few feel completely wasted. Even smaller roles contribute to the atmosphere of uncertainty and shifting allegiances that define the story. Everyone seems connected to the larger narrative in some way. That's not easy to accomplish with a cast this large. By the end of the film, one of the most satisfying things isn't just seeing the heroes succeed. It's seeing how these relationships have changed, how trust has been built, how loyalties have been tested, how characters have influenced each other. Because at its core, The Winter Soldier isn't really about one hero operating alone. It's about a group of people trying to navigate a world where trust has become increasingly difficult to find. And the way those relationships evolve along the journey is a major reason why the film feels richer than a typical action blockbuster. The action may get most of the attention, but the character dynamics are what give the story its heart. If there's one character who benefits almost as much as Steve Rogers from The Winter Soldier, it's Natasha Romanoff. Because before this movie, Black Widow had certainly made an impression in the MCU, but she often felt like a supporting piece within someone else's story. She was cool, she was capable, she always seemed to know more than everyone else, but we rarely got to spend enough time with her to understand who she actually was beneath all the espionage skills and confident one-liners. The Winter Soldier changes that. For the first time, Natasha feels less like an accessory to the plot and more like a fully integrated part of the story. And honestly, the movie is much better because of it. What's fascinating is how naturally she fits into the film's spy thriller atmosphere. Unlike Steve, Natasha has spent her entire life operating in a world built on secrets. Deception, covert operations, hidden agendas, moral gray areas. This is familiar territory for her. She understands how that world works. Steve doesn't. That contrast becomes one of the strongest elements in the entire movie. In many ways, Natasha functions as Steve's guide through this environment, not because she's wiser or stronger, but because she understands complexities that he still struggles with. She knows that information is currency. She knows that trust isn't always simple. She knows that people can be both allies and liabilities at the same time. Those experiences give her a perspective that Steve lacks. At the same time, Steve's influence starts affecting her as well, and that's what makes the relationship interesting. The dynamic isn't one-sided. The film isn't simply about Natasha teaching Steve how the modern world works. It's also about Steve reminding Natasha that some ideals are still worth believing in. There's a subtle exchange happening between them throughout the movie. She becomes a little more open. He becomes a little more adaptable. Neither character completely changes, but both grow from the relationship. That's good character writing. What I particularly like is that the movie never reduces Natasha to a sidekick role. She's constantly contributing to the investigation. Making decisions, driving the plot forward, gathering information, solving problems. There are multiple moments where the story simply doesn't move forward without her. That's important because it allows her to feel like an equal participant rather than someone tagging along behind the hero. The film also gives her more emotional depth than many previous appearances. Not in a dramatic, scene-stealing way, more through small moments, brief conversations, quiet admissions, hints about how she views herself and her past. The movie never stops to deliver a lengthy character biography, but it reveals enough to make Natasha feel more human. You start to see the person beneath the spy, and that makes her far more compelling. There's also a confidence to Scarlett Johansson's performance here that really stands out. By this point, she seems completely comfortable in the role. Nothing feels forced, nothing feels performative. She understands exactly how much humor, vulnerability, intelligence, and mystery the character requires. The balance is remarkably effective. Another thing that works is how Natasha never becomes overshadowed by the larger conspiracy. With so many moving pieces, it would have been easy for supporting characters to fade into the background. Instead, she remains one of the film's emotional anchors. Whenever the story starts becoming complicated, Natasha's interactions with Steve help keep everything grounded. Those conversations often reveal just as much about the themes of the movie as the larger plot developments. Questions about trust, identity, redemption, loyalty, they're all woven into her character arc. By the end of the film, Natasha feels more complete than she ever had before. Not because she suddenly becomes the focus of the story, but because the movie finally gives her room to exist as more than a highly skilled operative. She becomes a genuine character, a flawed one, a complicated one, a fascinating one. And honestly, when people talk about why The Winter Soldier remains one of the MCU's strongest films, Black Widow's role deserves far more credit than it usually gets. Because while Steve Rogers may be the heart of the movie, Natasha Romanoff is a huge part of what gives it its intelligence, nuance, and emotional balance. Introducing a new character into an already crowded sequel is usually harder than it looks. A lot of the time, you can immediately tell when a character is being included mainly because future movies are going to need them. They show up, say a few lines, help out in a fight scene, and then spend the rest of the film feeling like a trailer for something else. Falcon never really falls into that trap, and that's one of the reasons his introduction works so well. What's funny is that when Sam Wilson first appears, the movie doesn't make a huge deal out of it. There are no dramatic announcements. No grand entrance, no scene that screams, "Pay attention, this person will be important later." He's just there, a veteran going for a run, a guy having a conversation. A regular person trying to move forward after difficult experiences. The movie lets you meet Sam Wilson before it introduces Falcon. That was a smart decision, because by the time the wings show up, you've already formed an impression of the person underneath them. And honestly, that's something a lot of superhero films forget to do. What immediately stands out about Sam is how grounded he feels. In a story filled with spies, secret organizations, conspiracies, and super soldiers, he's probably the most relatable character in the film. He's not operating from some giant headquarters. He's not controlling international intelligence networks. He's not carrying decades of historical baggage. He's simply someone trying to help people. That quality makes him fit naturally alongside Steve Rogers. The two characters actually have more in common than it initially seems. Both are veterans. Both understand sacrifice. Both know what it's like to carry responsibilities that never completely leave you behind. And perhaps most importantly, both are fundamentally decent people. That's why their friendship develops so quickly. The movie doesn't force it. It feels earned. There's a mutual respect between them almost immediately, but it never feels artificial. Sam isn't impressed because Steve is Captain America. Steve doesn't trust Sam because the script tells him to. They connect because they recognize similar qualities in each other, and that relationship becomes increasingly important as the story progresses. What I appreciate most is that Sam brings a completely different energy to the film. Steve often carries the emotional weight of the story. Natasha carries much of the secrecy and ambiguity. Sam brings perspective. He has a way of cutting through situations without overcomplicating them. He's practical, reliable, steady. The kind of person you'd actually want around during a crisis. Anthony Mackie deserves a lot of credit for that. From the moment he arrives, he feels comfortable in the role. He's charismatic without trying too hard. Funny without becoming the comic relief. Capable without needing the movie to constantly remind you how capable he is. It's a very natural performance. And because of that, Sam never feels like an outsider who wandered into the story halfway through. He feels like he belongs. The Falcon suit itself is also one of the cooler additions to the movie, not because it's flashy, although it certainly looks impressive. It's because it fits the grounded approach the film takes toward action. Even with advanced technology involved, it still feels like equipment designed for a specific purpose rather than a magical solution to every problem. That practical feel helps Falcon blend into the movie's spy thriller atmosphere. But honestly, the suit isn't the reason people remember the character. It's Sam, his loyalty, his calmness, his willingness to help even when helping places him directly in danger. The movie never spends much time convincing the audience that Steve should trust him. It simply shows why, and that's far more effective. By the end of The Winter Soldier, Falcon doesn't feel like a new addition anymore. He feels like part of the team, part of the world, part of Captain America's story. That's actually a remarkable achievement considering how many superhero films struggle to introduce new characters without making them feel forced. Sam Wilson arrives naturally, earns his place naturally, and leaves the film feeling essential rather than optional. And that's probably the highest compliment you can give any character introduction. For a character who's been hovering around the edges of the MCU since almost the very beginning, The Winter Soldier might be the first movie that really gives Nick Fury something substantial to do. Before this, Fury often felt like the man behind the curtain, the recruiter, the strategist, the guy who showed up at the end of movies with another mission, another warning, or another mysterious plan. Important, absolutely. But rarely the focus. Here, that changes. And honestly, it changes in a way that makes the entire story stronger. One of the smartest decisions the movie makes is allowing Nick Fury to become vulnerable. Not emotionally vulnerable in the traditional sense, but vulnerable as a character. For years, Fury had been presented as the person who always seemed 5 steps ahead of everyone else. He had information nobody else possessed. He controlled vast resources. He operated with a level of confidence that suggested he always knew more than he was saying. In The Winter Soldier, that certainty starts to crack. Suddenly, Fury doesn't know who he can trust. Suddenly, the systems he's helped build are working against him. Suddenly, being the smartest guy in the room isn't enough. And that shift creates immediate tension. Because if someone like Nick Fury is worried, then maybe the situation is more serious than it first appeared. The movie uses him almost like an early warning signal. He's the first major character who truly understands how dangerous things have become. Long before Steve Rogers starts uncovering the larger conspiracy, Fury already senses that something is deeply wrong. That paranoia becomes contagious. Once Fury begins questioning people, the audience starts questioning them too. That's an incredibly effective storytelling tool. Then there's the famous attack sequence. Even years later, it remains one of the most memorable scenes in the film, partly because it's exciting, partly because it's tense, but mostly because it completely changes how we view the story moving forward. Up until that point, Fury feels protected by his position. He feels untouchable. The moment that illusion disappears, the movie becomes much more dangerous. Nobody feels safe anymore, not even Nick Fury. And that's exactly the point. What I particularly like is how Fury represents a different philosophy from Steve Rogers. The two men are ultimately trying to accomplish similar goals, but they approach those goals in completely different ways. Steve believes in transparency. Fury believes in preparation. Steve values trust. Fury values information. Steve wants clear answers. Fury is comfortable operating in uncertainty. Neither perspective is presented as entirely right or entirely wrong. The film allows both viewpoints to exist, and that creates some fascinating tension between them. You get the sense that Fury genuinely respects Steve, even when Steve questions his decisions. Likewise, Steve may not always agree with Fury, but he understands the weight of the responsibilities Fury carries. Their relationship feels layered because it's built on mutual respect rather than constant agreement. Samuel L. Jackson also deserves credit for bringing a different side of Fury to the screen. This isn't just the cool, confident director of SHIELD delivering sharp one-liners. There's frustration here, concern, exhaustion, suspicion. For perhaps the first time, we see a version of Fury who realizes that his own systems may have failed him. That realization adds depth to the character. The movie also uses Fury as a bridge between the personal and institutional sides of the story. On one level, he's a character. On another, he represents SHIELD itself, its strengths, its flaws, its ambitions, its mistakes. As the organization begins unraveling, Fury's role becomes even more important because he's forced to confront many of the same questions Steve is asking. Questions about power, trust, accountability, and whether good intentions are enough when the system itself becomes compromised. By the time the movie ends, Fury feels far more complete than he did in earlier MCU appearances. Not because he suddenly becomes the main character, but because the story finally allows him to be more than the man with all the answers. It allows him to be part of the uncertainty, part of the danger, part of the problem, and ultimately part of the solution. That's what makes The Winter Soldier such a significant chapter for Nick Fury. For once, he isn't just setting events into motion, he's caught in them, and that makes him far more interesting. One of the most interesting things about The Winter Soldier is that the character whose name is in the title isn't actually the main driving force behind the conspiracy, and yet somehow, he's still the most intimidating presence in the entire movie. That's not an easy balance to pull off. A lot of villains become less interesting the more they're explained. The mystery disappears, the threat shrinks, and eventually they just become another obstacle for the hero to overcome. The Winter Soldier works differently. For a large portion of the film, he feels less like a person and more like a force. He appears, he causes chaos, he disappears, and every time he enters a scene, the entire atmosphere changes. There's no dramatic speech, no grand monologue, no lengthy explanation of his motivations, just an immediate sense that things are about to get very bad for whoever happens to be standing in front of him. That's what makes him effective. The movie understands that mystery can be powerful. Before we know who he is, we're allowed to experience him the same way the characters do, as an unknown, a ghost, a rumor made real, someone whose reputation arrives before he does. And when he finally starts taking action, the film backs up that reputation. What I appreciate is that his danger doesn't come from exaggerated powers or world-ending abilities. It's his efficiency. Everything about him feels precise. Calculated, controlled. He's not reckless. He's not theatrical. He's simply very, very good at what he does. That makes him feel more threatening than villains who spend half their screen time announcing how powerful they are. The action scenes benefit enormously from that approach. Whenever the Winter Soldier is involved, the fights immediately become more personal, more physical, more intense. There's a sense that Steve is facing someone who can genuinely challenge him rather than merely delaying him until the next plot point. And that's important because Captain America can sometimes be a difficult character to threaten convincingly. He's strong, he's skilled, he's experienced. The Winter Soldier feels like one of the few opponents who can actually push him to his limits. But the character becomes far more interesting once the mystery surrounding his identity starts unfolding, because suddenly the conflict stops being purely physical. Now there's emotional weight attached to it. The film transforms a dangerous assassin into something much more complicated, a living connection to Steve's past, a reminder that not everything Steve lost stayed buried in history. That's where the character really elevates beyond a standard villain. The best antagonists often force heroes to confront something about themselves. The Winter Soldier does exactly that. Every encounter becomes about more than winning a fight. It's about memory, identity, loss, the collision between the past and the present. The movie never lets Steve view him as just another enemy, and that creates a tension that grows stronger as the story progresses. There's also something tragic about the character. Even before the film fully reveals his circumstances, you can sense that there's more happening beneath the surface. He's not driven by greed. He's not seeking power. He's not chasing domination. He's a weapon being used by larger forces. And once that reality becomes clear, the audience's relationship with the character begins to change. You still fear him, but you also begin to understand him. That's a difficult line for a movie to walk. Make a villain too sympathetic and they stop feeling threatening. Make them too threatening and they stop feeling human. The Winter Soldier manages to do both. He's dangerous enough to raise the stakes and tragic enough to create emotional investment. Sebastian Stan deserves a lot of credit for that. For much of the movie, he has very little dialogue compared to other major characters. The performance relies heavily on physical presence, body language, and intensity, and it works. Every appearance feels significant. Every confrontation feels important. Even when he's silent, the character commands attention. What's fascinating in retrospect is that many superhero movies introduce villains who exist solely to be defeated by the final act. The Winter Soldier feels different. He matters to the story. He matters to Steve Rogers. And perhaps most importantly, he continues to matter after the credits roll. That's a big reason why the character remains one of the most memorable antagonists in the MCU, not because he's the most powerful, not because he's the most evil, but because he's deeply connected to the emotional heart of the story. And when a villain becomes inseparable from the hero's personal journey, that's when they stop being just an antagonist. They become essential. One of the smartest casting decisions in The Winter Soldier might actually be one that doesn't get talked about enough anymore: Robert Redford. Because the moment you hear that a legendary actor like Robert Redford is joining a Marvel movie, your attention immediately shifts. Not because he's playing a superhero, not because he's delivering action scenes, but because actors of his stature bring a certain weight with them. The audience automatically pays closer attention. And The Winter Soldier uses that to its advantage. Alexander Pierce is a fascinating character because, at first glance, he doesn't seem particularly threatening. He's not physically imposing. He's not walking around in armor. He's not carrying some futuristic weapon. He's a man in a suit, a man sitting in meetings, a man having conversations, and somehow that's exactly what makes him dangerous. The film understands that power doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks respectable, professional, trustworthy. That's where Pierce becomes such an effective presence within the story. While the Winter Soldier represents visible danger, Pierce represents institutional danger. the kind that hides behind authority, influence, and legitimacy. And honestly, that fits perfectly with the themes the movie is exploring. Throughout the film, there's this growing sense that the real threat isn't necessarily the assassin pulling the trigger. It's the person deciding where the trigger should be aimed. Pierce embodies that idea. He's calm, controlled, patient. He rarely raises his voice. He rarely loses composure. The character doesn't rely on intimidation in the traditional sense. Instead, he relies on confidence. The confidence of someone who believes they're completely justified in what they're doing. That's always more unsettling, because the most interesting villains rarely see themselves as villains. They see themselves as the people willing to make difficult decisions that others are too afraid to make. That's exactly how Pierce operates. He doesn't view his actions as evil. He views them as necessary. And that's what gives the character complexity. You may completely disagree with him, but you understand the logic he's using. The film benefits enormously from having that kind of antagonist. Especially because Steve Rogers is such a principled character. The conflict becomes ideological rather than purely physical. It's not simply hero versus villain. It's two fundamentally different visions of how the world should function. One built on freedom and trust, the other built on control and preemptive security. That clash gives their scenes far more weight than a standard superhero confrontation. And then there's Redford's performance itself. What's remarkable is how effortless it feels. He never appears to be trying too hard, never chewing scenery, never forcing menace into the role. He simply exists within the film with a level of authority that makes people listen whenever he speaks. That's the benefit of casting someone with decades of screen presence. The performance feels lived in, natural, believable. Several actors could have played this role as an obvious comic book villain. Redford plays him like a powerful political figure who genuinely believes he's acting in the world's best interests. That approach makes the character much more effective. What's also interesting is how Pierce helps reinforce the film's conspiracy elements. The closer the story gets to him, the larger the conspiracy begins to feel. He's one of the key figures who transforms the movie from a personal mystery into a systemic crisis. Without him, the story would lose much of its political dimension. The film needs someone capable of representing the institutional side of the conflict. Pierce fills that role perfectly. And while The Winter Soldier may get the title and much of the marketing attention, Alexander Pierce arguably serves as the narrative engine behind many of the film's biggest ideas. He's the face of the philosophy Steve Rogers is fighting against, the face of a system willing to sacrifice principles in pursuit of control. That's why the character leaves such a strong impression, not because he's flashy, not because he's physically intimidating, but because he represents something larger than himself. And Robert Redford's presence gives that role exactly the credibility it needs. It's one of those performances that quietly elevates the entire movie without constantly demanding attention. And sometimes those are the most valuable performances of all. One thing that becomes really obvious when watching The Winter Soldier is just how much the film benefits from having a cast that completely understands the assignment. Because this isn't one of those movies where a single performance has to carry everything. The story is simply too large for that. There are too many moving pieces, too many intersecting relationships, and too many important characters for the film to succeed if even a few performances feel out of place. Thankfully, that never really happens. In fact, one of the movie's greatest strengths is how consistently strong the cast is from top to bottom. Let's start with Chris Evans. By this point, he isn't trying to become Captain America anymore. He is Captain America. There's a confidence in his performance here that wasn't quite as developed in the first film. Steve Rogers feels fully formed. Evans understands exactly who this character is, and more importantly, who he isn't. He never plays Steve as a perfect superhero. He plays him as a decent man trying to navigate increasingly complicated situations. That's a much harder balance than it sounds. Because if you lean too heavily into the heroism, the character becomes bland. If you lean too heavily into the self-doubt, the character loses the qualities that make him inspiring. Evans finds the middle ground beautifully. Then there's Scarlett Johansson, who arguably gets some of the strongest material she's had in the MCU up to this point. The film finally gives Natasha Romanoff room to exist beyond brief appearances and supporting player duties. Johansson takes full advantage of that opportunity. She brings intelligence, humor, mystery, and vulnerability to the role without ever making it feel forced. The chemistry she shares with Evans becomes one of the movie's most important ingredients. Samuel L. Jackson is equally strong. What's interesting is that Fury feels more exposed here than he has in previous appearances. Jackson still brings his trademark confidence and authority, but the movie also allows glimpses of uncertainty and frustration that make the character feel more human. That added dimension helps tremendously. Anthony Mackie makes an immediate impression as Sam Wilson. Introducing a new major character in a sequel can be difficult, especially one who has to earn a place among already established favorites. Mackie pulls it off effortlessly. There's an easy likability to his performance that makes Falcon feel like he belongs almost immediately. You understand why Steve trusts him. You understand why audiences embraced him. And that's not always easy to achieve with a brand new character. Sebastian Stan faces a completely different challenge. For much of the film, he's playing a character defined more by presence than dialogue. That requires a different skill set. The Winter Soldier needs to feel intimidating before he becomes emotionally significant, and Stan manages both. His physicality does a lot of the work early on, but once the emotional layers begin emerging, he reveals a surprising amount of depth beneath the character's cold exterior. Then there's Robert Redford. Honestly, his presence alone gives the movie a certain level of credibility, not because audiences automatically trust him, but because he brings decades of screen experience into every scene. He understands exactly how much to give the character and never overplays anything. The result is a villain who feels believable rather than theatrical. Even the smaller supporting roles contribute something memorable. Kobe Smulders, Frank Grillo, Emily Van Camp, Toby Jones, and several others all leave an impression despite relatively limited screen time. That's usually a sign of strong casting. When even minor characters feel purposeful, the world becomes more convincing. What's particularly impressive is how nobody feels like they're competing for attention. Large ensemble films often run into a problem where every actor seems to be performing in a slightly different movie. That's not the case here. Everyone feels aligned with the same tone, the same atmosphere, the same storytelling goals. That consistency helps hold the entire film together. And perhaps most importantly, the performances make the relationships believable. The friendships feel genuine, the distrust feels genuine, the betrayals feel genuine, the emotional moments land because the actors make them feel real. That's ultimately why the cast works so well. Not because every performance is flashy, not because every character receives equal screen time, but because every actor contributes to the same larger goal, making this world feel lived in and believable. And when a film with this many characters manages to accomplish that, it's a significant achievement. The action may draw audiences in, the story may keep them invested, but the cast is what makes them care. Something that often gets overlooked when people talk about The Winter Soldier is that a huge amount of the movie's success comes down to chemistry, not action, not visual effects, not even the conspiracy storyline. The movie understands that scale isn't always the same thing as intensity. In fact, some of the most intense moments involve only a few characters. Take the elevator fight, or the pursuit sequences, or the various confrontations between Steve and the Winter Soldier. None of those scenes rely on massive destruction. What makes them exciting is proximity. You feel close to the danger. Every hit matters. Every mistake matters. Every decision matters. The action feels grounded because the consequences feel immediate. That's where The Winter Soldier differs from many superhero films of its era. A lot of blockbusters start large and then get larger. This movie starts personal, then gradually expands, and for the first two acts, that approach is incredibly effective. The film almost feels like an espionage thriller that occasionally remembers it's part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The focus remains on investigations, manhunts, conspiracies, escapes, and survival. Even the larger action scenes are often built around very specific objectives rather than pure destruction. Characters are trying to retrieve information, protect someone, escape capture, reach a destination. Those goals keep the action focused, but then the movie reaches its final act, and this is where opinions start to diverge. Because after spending so much time delivering grounded tension, the film eventually embraces blockbuster spectacle. The scale increases dramatically. The stakes become global. Massive machinery enters the equation. The sky fills with explosions. Entire structures become battlegrounds. Suddenly, we're much closer to the traditional Marvel formula. Now, to be clear, a lot of people love this escalation. The finale is undeniably impressive. It's ambitious. It's exciting. It's visually massive. And it delivers the kind of payoff audiences expect from a major superhero film. But I also understand why some viewers slightly prefer the earlier sections of the movie. There's something uniquely compelling about watching Captain America operate with limited resources, surrounded by uncertainty, trying to navigate a conspiracy he barely understands. Those scenes have a rawness that large-scale spectacle sometimes struggles to replicate. It's the difference between tension and excitement, The first two acts are often built around tension. The third act leans more heavily into excitement. Neither approach is inherently better, they're just different. What's impressive is that The Winter Soldier manages to make both approaches work within the same movie. That's not easy. Many films struggle to transition from intimate storytelling to massive spectacle without feeling like they're changing genres halfway through. This movie mostly avoids that problem because the emotional conflicts remain intact. Even when the action becomes larger, the story never completely loses sight of Steve Rogers, the Winter Soldier, and the personal relationships driving the narrative. That's what keeps the climax from becoming empty spectacle. The explosions are bigger, the emotional stakes remain personal, and that's an important distinction. The movie understands that audiences don't connect with scale alone, they connect with people. The spectacle only works because the film spent so much time making us care about the characters experiencing it. In a way, that's the balancing act The Winter Soldier pulls off throughout its entire runtime. It gives you the grounded intensity of a spy thriller. It gives you the large-scale excitement of a superhero blockbuster, and somehow it manages to make those two very different styles coexist. That's one of the reasons the film remains such a standout within the MCU. It never fully commits to being one thing. It's constantly walking the line between intimate and epic, between grounded and spectacular. And for the most part, it walks that line remarkably well. One of the more interesting discussions surrounding The Winter Soldier over the years has been the way people talk about its visual effects. Because depending on who you ask, you'll hear two very different opinions. Some people look at this movie and see one of Marvel's strongest technical achievements. Others point to certain sequences and argue that some of the CGI hasn't aged quite as gracefully as the film's reputation might suggest. And honestly, both perspectives have some truth to them. What's important, though, is understanding why the conversation exists in the first place. The reason people debate the effects so much is because The Winter Soldier often goes out of its way to make things feel practical. That's the key difference. The movie wants you to believe that these events are happening in real locations with real physical consequences. The action isn't presented like a fantasy spectacle floating in a digital environment. It feels grounded in streets, buildings, vehicles, elevators, highways, and recognizable spaces. That approach changes audience expectations. When a film works hard to create a sense of realism, viewers naturally become more aware of moments when visual effects stand out. And there are definitely moments where that happens. A few aerial sequences, certain large-scale shots, some moments involving digital environments. Depending on the viewer, those scenes either blend seamlessly into the movie or become slightly more noticeable. But what's fascinating is that even people who criticize individual effects shots often praise the overall action. That's because the film's success isn't built entirely on CGI. It's built on a combination of elements. Practical stunt work, fight choreography, vehicle crashes, explosions, physical performances, careful camera work, all of those components are working together. The visual effects are supporting the action rather than replacing it. And that's a very important distinction. A lot of blockbuster films become dependent on computer-generated spectacle. The action begins feeling weightless because almost everything exists inside a digital space. The Winter Soldier generally avoids that problem. Even when CGI is being used, there's usually a physical foundation underneath it. You can feel the stunt work. You can feel the practical elements. You can feel actual bodies moving through actual environments. That creates a sense of weight that many action movies struggle to achieve. The highway sequences are a great example. The vehicle destruction is spectacular, but it also feels dangerous. The collisions have force. The impacts have consequences. The scene isn't relying purely on digital imagery to create excitement. Likewise, many of the hand-to-hand combat sequences work because they're rooted in choreography and performance first. The effects enhance those moments rather than define them. And honestly, that's why the action has held up as well as it has. Technology always changes. Visual effects always age. What looks groundbreaking one year may look ordinary a decade later, but strong stunt work tends to remain effective. Strong choreography remains effective. Strong filmmaking remains effective. That's where The Winter Soldier gains much of its longevity. The movie isn't asking audiences to be impressed solely because something looks expensive. It's asking them to be invested because the action feels tangible. Of course, not every technical choice is perfect. Some viewers have pointed out moments where the digital effects become more obvious than intended. Others feel that certain sequences look fantastic even today. That's simply part of the debate. What's difficult to argue against, however, is the overall impact. Because regardless of where someone falls on the CGI discussion, most people agree that the film delivers a remarkably engaging action experience. The technical craftsmanship serves the story, the spectacle serves the tension, and the visual effects serve the action. That's the order. And I think that's why The Winter Soldier continues to stand out, not because every effect is flawless, not because every shot is perfect, but because the movie understands that visual effects are tools, not the main attraction. The goal isn't to overwhelm the audience with digital imagery. The goal is to make them believe what's happening. For the vast majority of its runtime, The Winter Soldier accomplishes exactly that. And that's ultimately what matters most. One thing that becomes more noticeable every time I revisit The Winter Soldier is how different it looks from a lot of the Marvel movies that came before it. Not radically different, not to the point where it feels disconnected from the MCU, but different enough that you immediately feel a shift in tone, and a lot of that comes down to the visual style. The movie has a certain sharpness to it. A certain grit, not the kind of artificial darkness that some blockbusters mistake for maturity, but a visual approach that feels intentionally more grounded and more tactile than many superhero films of the time. The world looks lived in, the locations feel real. Washington, D.C. doesn't look like a giant digital playground waiting for superheroes to crash through it. It feels like an actual place where people work, commute, and live their lives. That realism becomes incredibly important because the movie is constantly asking you to believe in a conspiracy operating beneath the surface of everyday life. The visuals help sell that idea. A lot of scenes are shot in ways that emphasize observation and suspicion. Characters are being watched, following people, gathering information, hiding things. The camera often reinforces the sense that somebody is always paying attention. It's subtle, but it contributes greatly to the atmosphere. Then there's the action photography. This is where the movie really separates itself from many of its contemporaries. One of the biggest compliments I can give the film is that you can usually tell what's happening. That sounds obvious, but it's actually surprisingly rare. A lot of modern action movies rely on hyperactive editing, endless close-ups, and chaotic camera movement. The result is often noise disguised as excitement. The Winter Soldier takes a more disciplined approach. The action feels energetic, but it rarely becomes incomprehensible. You understand where characters are positioned. You understand who's attacking whom. You understand how the fights are progressing. That clarity allows the choreography to shine. The editing deserves a lot of credit for this. The cuts generally feel purposeful rather than frantic. The movie knows when to speed things up and when to let moments breathe. Particularly during action scenes, there's a rhythm to the editing that creates urgency without sacrificing coherence. You feel the momentum. But you never lose track of the story. That's a difficult balance. The film also does a great job creating visual variety. Some scenes feel intimate and claustrophobic. Others feel expansive and open. The movie moves comfortably between quiet conversations, tense investigations, covert operations, and large-scale action without ever feeling visually repetitive. Each section has its own energy, its own texture, its own purpose. Another thing I appreciate is the use of daylight. A surprising amount of the action takes place in bright, clearly visible environments. Highways, city streets, public spaces. That's actually a risk. When filmmakers shoot action in broad daylight, they can't hide behind darkness or visual confusion. Everything is exposed. The audience can see the effects, see the choreography, see the stunt work, see the mistakes if there are any. The fact that the movie remains so effective under those conditions says a lot about the confidence behind the filmmaking. The visual style also supports the movie's genre identity. Remember, this isn't just trying to be a superhero film, it's trying to be a conspiracy thriller. The cinematography reflects that. There are moments that feel closer to espionage cinema than traditional comic book storytelling. Surveillance imagery, hidden locations, covert meetings, political power structures, all of it contributes to a more mature visual atmosphere, and that atmosphere helps separate the movie from other MCU entries. What's interesting is that none of these choices call attention to themselves. The film isn't constantly trying to impress you with flashy camera tricks or showy visual experimentation. Everything serves the story. Everything serves the mood. Everything serves the characters. That's often the mark of strong visual storytelling. The audience feels the effect even if they aren't consciously thinking about it. By the end of the movie, you're left with something that feels surprisingly cohesive. The action looks different because the story is different. The camera moves differently because the tone is different. The editing feels different because the tension is different. Every visual decision seems aligned with the movie's larger identity. And that's a huge reason why The Winter Soldier remains visually distinctive more than a decade later. Not because it's the most colorful MCU film, not because it's the biggest, but because it knows exactly what kind of movie it wants to be, and its visual style reflects that at every level. Looking back now, it's kind of wild to remember that before The Winter Soldier, Anthony and Joe Russo weren't exactly the names most people expected to redefine the future of the MCU. Today, it's easy to associate them with some of Marvel's biggest successes, but at the time, handing them a Captain America sequel probably didn't feel like the obvious move. And honestly, that's part of what makes this film so interesting, because The Winter Soldier feels like the moment the Russo brothers announced themselves, not with flashy self-importance, not by trying to reinvent cinema, just by making a remarkably confident movie. What stands out immediately is how clearly they understand what kind of story they're telling. That sounds simple, but it's actually one of the hardest things for blockbuster directors to achieve. A lot of big franchise films end up feeling pulled in multiple directions. They're trying to satisfy studio expectations, set up future projects, deliver fan service, introduce new characters, and tell a complete story all at the same time. Sometimes you can feel that struggle while watching. The Winter Soldier rarely feels that way. The Russo brothers maintain a surprisingly strong sense of identity throughout the film. They know this is a Captain America story first, a conspiracy thriller second, and an MCU chapter third. That order matters, because even though the film contains major implications for the wider Marvel universe, it never feels like it's sacrificing its own narrative just to set up something else. The directors keep the focus where it belongs, on Steve Rogers. Everything ultimately circles back to him. The action, the politics, the conspiracies, the relationships, the emotional conflicts, they all serve the central character. That's strong direction. Another thing that impresses me is how well the Russos balance tone. This movie could have easily become too serious. After all, it's dealing with government corruption, surveillance, betrayal, assassination attempts, and institutional collapse. That's heavy material, yet the film never becomes oppressive. There's humor. There's personality. There's room for characters to simply exist together. The Russos understand that tension works best when audiences occasionally get a chance to breathe. That rhythm is present throughout the movie. What I also appreciate is their restraint. A lot of directors faced with a superhero blockbuster would be tempted to make everything bigger. Bigger explosions, bigger visual effects, bigger spectacle. The Russo brothers often go in the opposite direction. Many of the film's strongest scenes are surprisingly intimate. A conversation, a revelation, a moment of uncertainty, a character realizing they can no longer trust someone. The directors understand that tension doesn't always come from scale. Sometimes it comes from information. Sometimes it comes from silence. Sometimes it comes from a single decision. That's a very thriller-oriented mindset, and it's a huge reason the movie feels different from many of its MCU counterparts. Their handling of action deserves praise as well. Not just because the action is exciting, but because it's purposeful. Every major sequence feels connected to the story. The fights aren't simply there because a superhero movie requires action every 15 minutes. The action emerges naturally from the narrative. Characters are escaping, protecting information, being hunted, trying to survive. The objectives remain clear, and because the objectives remain clear, the action remains engaging. The Russos also deserve credit for managing a surprisingly large ensemble. As we've already discussed, there are a lot of important characters moving through this story, yet very few feel wasted. Everyone seems to have a role. Everyone contributes something. Maintaining that balance is difficult, especially in a film built around conspiracies and shifting loyalties. The directors keep things remarkably coherent. What's perhaps most impressive, though, is how they expanded what an MCU movie could feel like. Before The Winter Soldier, Marvel films largely followed a familiar formula. Successful formula, certainly, but familiar. The Russo brothers showed that these characters could thrive inside different genres. You could take Captain America and place him inside a political thriller. You could emphasize espionage over fantasy. You could build tension through distrust rather than world-ending lasers, and it could still feel like a Marvel movie. That realization would end up having enormous consequences for the franchise moving forward. But even if we ignore everything that came afterward, The Winter Soldier remains an impressive piece of direction on its own. It's focused, confident, disciplined. The Russos never seem overwhelmed by the scale of the production, and they never lose sight of the story's emotional core. For many filmmakers, that would have been enough. For Anthony and Joe Russo, it turned out to be just the beginning. And watching The Winter Soldier now, you can already see why Marvel trusted them with even bigger challenges later on. As much as I admire The Winter Soldier, I don't think it's one of those movies that's completely immune to criticism. And honestly, part of what makes discussing it interesting is that most of the criticisms come from people who actually like the film. They're not arguing that it's bad. They're arguing that it's very good when it occasionally flirts with being great. The most common criticism probably involves the plot itself. Now, don't get me wrong, I think the story is one of the film's biggest strengths. The conspiracy angle works, the mystery is engaging, and the political themes give the narrative more weight than a typical superhero adventure. But there are moments where the movie risks becoming a little too busy. As the story progresses, more characters enter the picture, more information gets revealed, more moving pieces start colliding with one another. For the most part, the film manages this complexity well, but there are stretches where it feels like it's trying to juggle a lot at once. You can occasionally sense the screenplay rushing to connect every thread before the climax arrives. It's never confusing enough to derail the movie, but it's noticeable. Another criticism I've seen repeated involves the balance between the conspiracy and the Winter Soldier himself, which is actually a fair point. For a character whose name is in the title, the Winter Soldier sometimes feels like he's operating slightly outside the main narrative. He's obviously important, extremely important. But for much of the movie, the larger conspiracy surrounding SHIELD and Hydra receives more attention than the title character. There are moments where it almost feels like two different stories are running parallel to one another. Thankfully, they eventually intersect in meaningful ways, but I understand why some viewers wanted even more focus on the Winter Soldier himself. Then there's the question of predictability. Some of the film's reveals work wonderfully. Others are easier to see coming. Depending on your familiarity with comic books, spy thrillers, or simply blockbuster storytelling in general, certain twists may not shock you as much as the movie hopes. That doesn't necessarily ruin the experience. A predictable reveal can still be effective if the emotional payoff works, but it's worth mentioning. The movie isn't constantly pulling off impossible surprises. There are also a few logic-related questions that occasionally surface. Nothing catastrophic, just those little moments where you start thinking about the mechanics of certain plans or decisions and realize they may not hold up under intense scrutiny. Most action thrillers have those moments. The Winter Soldier is no exception. Personally, I don't think they significantly damage the experience, but they're there if you're looking for them. Another area where opinions differ is the final act. Some viewers absolutely love it. Others feel the movie reaches its peak slightly earlier. After spending so much time building a grounded atmosphere, a few people feel that the climax leans a bit too heavily into traditional blockbuster spectacle. The stakes become larger, the action becomes bigger, the scale increases dramatically. For some, that's a satisfying payoff. For others, it loses a little of the intimacy that made the earlier sections so compelling. I can honestly see both sides of that argument. There's also the broader criticism that occasionally appears regarding Marvel movies in general. The idea that the films are more interested in being entertaining than truly challenging. That they're content to deliver strong blockbuster experiences without necessarily striving for something artistically transformative. Whether that's a fair criticism depends entirely on what you expect from the genre. Personally, I think The Winter Soldier pushes further than most superhero films, even if it doesn't completely escape certain franchise conventions. And that's really where many of the movie's criticisms tend to land. Not on catastrophic flaws, not on major failures, but on the feeling that it occasionally pulls back just before reaching another level. The funny thing is that many of these criticisms only exist because the movie sets such a high standard for itself. Nobody complains that a mediocre film didn't become a masterpiece. People make those arguments about movies they genuinely admire, and I think that's the case here. Even when the Winter Soldier stumbles, it usually stumbles while attempting something ambitious. The plot becomes busy because it's trying to be layered. The ending becomes larger because it's trying to provide a satisfying payoff. The themes become complicated because the movie wants to engage with bigger ideas. Those aren't bad problems to have. In fact, they're often signs of a film reaching beyond the limits of a standard blockbuster. So while The Winter Soldier certainly isn't perfect, most of its weaknesses feel relatively minor compared to everything it's doing right. And honestly, that's probably why the conversation around the movie remains so positive years later. People remember the strengths far more than the flaws, which is usually a pretty good sign. One of the things that becomes clearer with every passing year is just how important The Winter Soldier ended up being to the larger MCU. When the movie first came out, it was easy to view it simply as the second Captain America film. A really good one, sure, but still just another chapter in Marvel's growing universe. Looking back now, that's underselling it quite a bit. Because this movie didn't just continue the MCU, it changed it, and that's a distinction worth talking about. a lot of shared universe films function as connective tissue. They introduce characters, tease future storylines, and help move the larger franchise from point A to point B. There's nothing wrong with that. But The Winter Soldier does something more significant. It fundamentally alters the landscape of the world these characters live in. Before this film, certain institutions felt permanent, reliable, stable. The audience had developed assumptions about how the MCU worked and who occupied positions of power within it. The Winter Soldier takes many of those assumptions and tears them apart. The consequences aren't isolated to this movie, they ripple outward, and that's what makes the impact feel meaningful. The events here don't simply reset when the credits roll. Characters have to live with what happened. Organizations have to deal with what happened. Future stories have to acknowledge what happened. That's incredibly important in a shared universe. Because one of the biggest risks of franchise storytelling is that individual movies can start feeling disposable, fun in the moment, but ultimately inconsequential. The Winter Soldier never feels disposable. The changes it introduces matter, not just for Steve Rogers, but for the entire MCU. What's especially impressive is how naturally those connections are woven into the story. The movie isn't constantly stopping to remind you that future films exist. It's not spending half its runtime advertising upcoming projects. Instead, the larger implications emerge organically from the narrative itself. The story is focused on its own conflict. The consequences simply happen to extend beyond it. That's the ideal way to handle franchise continuity. The film also benefits from everything that came before it. Relationships established in earlier movies gain additional meaning here. Characters who might have seemed straightforward suddenly reveal new layers. Past events continue influencing present decisions. The MCU's interconnected nature becomes an advantage rather than a distraction. And that's partly why longtime Marvel fans connected so strongly with the movie. It rewards investment. Not in a way that feels exclusionary, but in a way that makes the universe feel coherent. You get the sense that previous stories mattered, that actions have consequences, that the world remembers. At the same time, the movie helped shape Marvel's future direction. After The Winter Soldier, there was a growing recognition that MCU films didn't all need to follow the exact same template. Characters could exist within different genres. Stories could experiment with different tones. Political thrillers, space adventures, heist films, fantasy epics, they could all coexist under the same umbrella. This movie played a major role in proving that. Its influence can be felt in many projects that followed, not because later films copied it directly, but because it expanded the creative possibilities available to the franchise. There's also the matter of Steve Rogers himself. His character arc moving forward becomes inseparable from the experiences of this film. The doubts, the revelations, the lessons learned, everything here leaves a mark. You can draw a direct line from The Winter Soldier to many of the choices Steve makes later in the MCU. The movie becomes a turning point not only for the universe, but for the character at its center. And that's why its legacy remains so strong. Some Marvel films are remembered for introducing iconic heroes. Some are remembered for spectacular battles. Some are remembered for major crossover events. The Winter Soldier is remembered because it altered the foundation of the world itself. It made the MCU feel less predictable, less comfortable, more complicated, more mature. And in doing so, it helped push the franchise into a new phase of storytelling. Years later, that's still one of its greatest achievements, not simply being a great Captain America movie, being a movie that permanently mattered. Every so often, you come across a movie that starts out as a sequel and somehow ends up becoming much more than that. I think Captain America, The Winter Soldier, is one of those movies. Because when you strip away all the expectations that existed around it at release, what you're left with is a film that accomplished something surprisingly difficult. It took a character that many people viewed as one of Marvel's least flashy heroes and gave him one of the most memorable stories in the entire franchise. And it did that without abandoning what made the character special in the first place. That's probably the achievement that impresses me most. The movie never tries to make Steve Rogers cooler by turning him into someone else. It doesn't make him darker. It doesn't make him cynical. It doesn't reinvent him through shock value. Instead, it places him inside a world that challenges everything he believes and then allows those beliefs to be tested. That's a far more interesting approach. Looking back at everything we've talked about, it's easy to see why the film has maintained such a strong reputation. The spy thriller structure works. The conspiracy storyline remains engaging. The political themes still feel relevant. The action sequences are among the strongest in the MCU. The cast is excellent. The Russo brothers bring a clear vision to the material. And perhaps most importantly, the movie never loses sight of its characters. For all the spectacle, all the twists, all the large-scale consequences, the emotional core remains surprisingly intimate. It's about trust. It's about identity. It's about loyalty. It's about figuring out what principles are worth holding onto when the world around you keeps changing. Those ideas give the film a depth that extends beyond its genre. Now, is it perfect? No, I don't think it is. There are moments where the plot becomes a little crowded. A few reveals are easier to predict than the movie intends. Some viewers may prefer the grounded tension of the earlier acts to the larger spectacle of the finale. And there are occasional logic questions that come with any blockbuster operating on this scale. But none of those issues significantly diminish what the film accomplishes. If anything, they stand out because the overall quality is so high. The movie sets a standard that invites closer examination. That's usually a sign that a film has done something right. What's especially interesting is how well The Winter Soldier has aged. A lot of blockbuster movies become trapped in the era that produced them. The visual effects date. The themes lose relevance. The excitement fades. This film has avoided much of that, partly because its themes remain relevant, partly because its action relies heavily on strong choreography and practical filmmaking principles, but mostly because the story is built around characters rather than gimmicks. Good character work tends to age better than almost anything else, and The Winter Soldier has plenty of it. Its legacy within the MCU is equally significant. This wasn't just another chapter in an ongoing franchise. It was a turning point, a movie that proved Marvel could successfully blend superhero storytelling with other genres, a movie that changed the trajectory of several characters, a movie whose consequences continued shaping future stories for years. Those aren't small accomplishments. And honestly, I think that's why the film still appears near the top of so many MCU rankings. Not because it's the biggest Marvel movie, not because it's the loudest, not because it has the most characters or the most explosions, but because it feels focused, purposeful, confident. It knows exactly what kind of story it wants to tell. More importantly, it tells that story well. At the end of the day, Captain America, The Winter Soldier succeeds as an action film. It succeeds as a political thriller. It succeeds as a character study. It succeeds as an MCU entry. And it succeeds as a sequel. Very few movies manage to check all of those boxes at the same time. That's why people still talk about it. That's why people still revisit it. And that's why, more than a decade after its release, it remains one of the strongest films not only in the Captain America trilogy, but in the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe. Some sequels continue a story. The Winter Soldier elevated one, and that's a legacy that has proven remarkably difficult to match.